So,
Yeah.
Iain McGilchrist, very welcome to Tanke podcast.
Thank you very much, Christer.
We are very happy to be publishing your book, The Master and His Emissary, and I know that's not your latest book, but the idea is to sort of introduce you to the Swedish audience with that book, and then maybe follow up later on. I mean, it's a massive piece, The Master of Things.
No, The Master is
The Matter of Things. I mean, it's a massive piece. It's 2 books. Is it like 1,500 pages or something?
It's something like that, but a couple of hundred of those are notes and references. But yes.
And I thought we should talk a bit about your personal sort of way into these questions, but I also would like to talk a bit about your ontology, your view of reality, and things like that. So yeah, let's just start. Should you start, Victoria?
Well, a good way to start is you telling us about how you choose that title, The Master and His Emissary, and where does it come from?
Well, it's an interesting question where it comes from. I say in the book that it's from Nietzsche, but you may have noticed that there is a footnote, and it's almost a postmodern footnote because all my notes are extremely precise. And in this one, I say very roughly based on Nietzsche, and now I can't find where. And I don't think it's got anything to do with Nietzsche, really. But somewhere along the line, I heard a story that was like this. I thought it was possibly in Nietzsche. And what's interesting is that I find that in most cultures, this story exists. So there is a version of it, a Chinese version, a Japanese version, a version in Iroquois people's legends about 2 powerful figures, one of whom sees much more, knows much more, and needs to superintend the other. But this other is rebellious, arrogant, and competitive, and thinks it knows much more than it does, and it displaces the master with very bad results for everybody, for the master, the emissary, and the community over which they presided. So really, it's a story about how a society falls to pieces because of this rivalry. And it just seemed very appropriate when I thought about where we are now. Because as you know, it refers to the 2 hemispheres of the brain. And the first surprise people have to get over is that the master is not the left hemisphere. The master is the right hemisphere.
Yes.
And its bureaucratic helper is the left hemisphere that knows very much less. And in my view, in our world at the moment, the right hemisphere is being ignored and the left hemisphere is running amok, as we say.
And when do you say that this have begun? Did it begin before the Renaissance or after the Renaissance?
Well, as you know, in the second half of the book, the first half of the book is mainly neuroscience and philosophy, but the second half is an attempt to review the history of the West from the Greeks onwards, looking at the main turning points in the history of ideas. And I identify that 3 times a civilization has flourished, come into being almost at a point of enormous richness, the Greeks, the Romans, and now ourselves, and that over time, each civilization has basically decayed, and in each you can see this triumph of the left hemisphere as the civilization decays. So if I had to put a sort of date on it, I would say probably somewhere around the late 17th century or the 18th century with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Now, these are very important periods, don't get me wrong. If I were alive at the time of the Enlightenment, I undoubtedly would have found myself an Enlightenment philosopher. But I've seen what has happened since, and there is such a thing as hubris, arrogance, thinking you know everything, and that is the besetting sin of the Enlightenment, and it's that I think has caused the problems that we now find.
Would you say that it sort of culminated with the Vienna Circle's logical positivism, I think it's called in English? Was that the worst case of this, or how do you see it?
Yes, there is a horrible period during which Western philosophy, Anglo-American analytic philosophy, really peaked on left hemisphere silliness, and logical positivism was one of the parts of this. But what I love is that there are people in that movement who saw that it was not enough and changed their whole ways. So,
and who were they? Who are you thinking about?
Well, I'm thinking about Wittgenstein in a way, but also in his pupil, who became professor of logic at Oxford, Friedrich Waismann.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, I like Waismann very much, and I quote him quite a lot in The Matter with Things.
Both of us are huge fans of Gödel, actually.
Yes.
And he was in the positivist circle as well, to begin with. But I mean, he was not an atheist, for example.
No, he was not, no. And of course, there are many physicists and mathematicians who are not atheists at all. One of the things I discovered that was extraordinary is that if you look at the beliefs of Nobel Prize winners, and this has been studied in depth at a book length, you find that of the winners of Nobel Prizes in the humanities, perhaps about a third were never believers in any kind of religious ideas. But as you come into the sciences, there come fewer and fewer people who are non-believers. It's extraordinary. And the least of all is physicists, of whom only 4.7% were at any time in their life atheists or even agnostics. So amongst physicists, there was a very, very, very high 95.3% of them, of Nobel Prize winning physicists, had some kind of a religious belief.
That's interesting. We actually met at the Nobel Prize ceremony in Stockholm in December. We met with Zeilinger and Clausse, the two Nobel Prize winners in physics. Yeah. And they're completely different in this case, because Clausse is a hardcore atheist and Zeilinger is not. I don't think Zeilinger is a theist, but he's definitely religious in some sense. But, so they're quite opposite views from their lifelong research in quantum physics.
Yes. And it's lovely that they've been honored in this way. No, I was just thinking it was very satisfying that they were honored in this particular way.
It was definitely, and Alain Aspect as well. I mean, the three, they really deserved it.
Exactly.
I want to get back to you on quantum physics, but first, your definition of, I'm interested in your definition of religion, actually, because I heard somewhere that you define yourself as a Taoist. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, I don't define myself as a Taoist, but I am a Taoist.
Okay.
and that's not incompatible with being many other things. In many ways, I'm a Buddhist. Buddhists flock to my work, and I've been often asked to speak to Buddhists. So I share that, but I also was brought up in a Christian culture, though my parents were not religious at all. I never went to church until I was in my teens. But nonetheless, I think I would call myself a very bad Christian. There are aspects of Christianity I don't really like. I think it can be dogmatic, and certainly fundamentalist Christians are as bad as fundamentalist anything, including fundamentalist atheists. I think fundamentalism is a problem. It's the dogma. And you can be dogmatic about religion or dogmatic against religion, but that dogmatic cast of mind is very left hemisphere and is a product of not really being able to think flexibly, imaginatively, to understand the importance of ambiguity, myths, metaphors, narratives, this sort of thing.
Yes.
But when it comes to Taoism or Buddhism, do you define those traditions as religions or rather as philosophies?
I think it's probably more accurate to call them philosophies, yes.
Yeah.
What I tend to call them, which is a slightly hackneyed phrase, but wisdom traditions. In other words, they are bodies of wisdom. The trouble with philosophy is that in the West it has rarely been associated with wisdom. I think in the pre-Socratic era it was, and I will annoy a lot of people if I say I'm not sure that Plato was as wise as he thought he was, but nonetheless, he probably did have some wisdom. But what has happened to philosophy for nearly 2,000 years was a distraction from the importance of things that only started to be perceived again in the period of the German idealist philosophers in the first part of the 19th century, particularly, in my view, Schelling. And then later in the century with people like Nietzsche, and in our own time by Wittgenstein, by Heidegger, and others.
Yeah. Is it all right if we come back to you for a while? And I don't think you're so famous yet in Sweden. So if you would like to tell us a bit about your story, what is your education, and a bit onwards from that.
Yes, okay. Yes, well, I count myself very lucky that I was able to go to a school with a scholarship, because otherwise my parents wouldn't have sent me, where the thinking was very broad and advanced. So we had a huge, it was wonderful. I was submerged, or not exactly submerged, but sort of swimming in an education that included the humanities and the classical languages, history, philosophy, and science, and was very broad-minded. And that I think made a great difference to me. The education was not narrowly geared to passing exams, but to what it should be. In other words, communicating an enthusiasm for thinking for yourself. And I was going to study theology and philosophy because I've all my life really been interested in philosophy, the big questions since childhood, actually. And in my teens, I saw there were things that just weren't right about philosophy. Like people said that the whole was the same as the sum of the parts. But even from the age of 13, I thought this is not right, actually. And the world is inert and it's inanimate, and we just receive data from it passively. But I didn't think this is right, that in fact there is a sort of reverberative relationship between us and the world, and so on. That opposites, for example, are not, in fact, as far apart from one another as they would be if they were on a straight line, but come towards one another as if they were on a circle. So all of these sort of things fascinated me, and I wanted to study the kind of philosophy that had a place in it for religious ideas, but also the kind of religion that was mainly philosophical. I wasn't particularly interested in studying the history of the Bible. So I wanted to do this theology and philosophy at Oxford. And to get into Oxford, you had to do an exam in some school subject, and I just chose English at random. And they said, oh, you mustn't do theology and philosophy. It's not an honours degree. You must get an honours degree. So I said, well, okay. And they said, you obviously like English. Why don't you do that? So I studied literature, but from a philosophical point of view, and wrote a book called Against Criticism in my 20s, which was unceremoniously remaindered after selling about 400 copies, and it is now worth a couple of £1,000 if you can find one on the market, which is satisfying. But after I graduated, I became a fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, which is a college that has no students. It's the only one in Oxford or Cambridge that has no students whatever, not even graduate students. It's only fellows. And the way I was able to do this was by sitting a 3-day exam. And at the end of that exam, they either choose 1 or 2 or none. And I was chosen. And this gave me 7 years in which I was allowed to do exactly what I wanted. Nobody asked me any questions or said, what are you publishing? I just was allowed to read, learn, and do whatever I wanted. And during that time, I wrote this book against criticism because I thought there was something very badly wrong with the way literature was studied. Not particularly by the teacher or tutor, as we call them, that I had, but generally, so that we took works of literature and we applied grand theories to them. We made them abstract and containers of ideas. And in this process, what had to remain implicit, what was subtle and difficult and ambiguous, was made crystal clear and became very banal. You know, you can take some wonderful poem that you can hardly even think of without tears coming to your eyes. And you say, what's it about? Well, what it says is it's very sad when somebody that you love dies. Well, okay, I know that. But so in this way, you've turned, I call it the un-Midas touch. You know, the Greek King Midas, who everything he touched turned to gold. Well, this way of approaching literature made the gold turn to shit. And so this was a very bad idea. And I thought what the problem is that we've disembodied literature, we've abstracted it, we've taken it out of context, and we've made the implicit explicit, and we've lost everything that was unique about it. It could be replaced by another general thing that's like it. And I thought this is about the...
Sorry. Does the implicit always get destroyed when you turn it explicit? Is there any way to keep the implicit while still doing what the explicit does?
Well, I think there is. Let me make a digression to answer that question. I mean, in essence, it's rather like explaining a joke. I mean, it's no longer funny once you've explained it. But there is this process whereby this is something that's very central to my philosophy, but we'd have to jump ahead here, that things that are understood by the right hemisphere can be taken apart, analyzed in this way by the left hemisphere, but then must be reintegrated by the right hemisphere. And the easiest image for this is of learning a piece of music. So say you're a pianist, you love this piece of music, you sit down at the keyboard, you try to play it. See, the thing has appealed to you, spoken to you at the right hemisphere level. But then you discover that you have to go back over certain bars and practice them because the fingering is difficult and all of that. And you theorize and you see that, oh, at this point, we return to the tonic and so on. Now, that's all fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But when you go on stage and perform, you must forget all of that completely. It must no longer be obtruding in your mind. And so what I would say is, yes, it's okay to make explicit the implicit, as long as at the end of that process, you take that knowledge back and render it implicit again in your mind when you read it, so that you read it as a whole again, not as a collection of bits and pieces. So that was where I was at. And I thought the problem was in the area of what philosophers used to call, maybe they still call, the mind-body problem. And I went to many seminars on the subject, but I just found the philosophers were themselves too disembodied in their approach to this. And I thought I needed to explore this in a more embodied way, which was to see what happens when things go wrong in somebody's brain and it changes their whole experienced world, or when something happens in their experience of the world and actually changes their body and their brain. This is very interesting. This is a place where you can really see how the mind and the body are at one, really. And that meant studying medicine. So 10 years older than the young people who starting their medical training, I started my medical training. And after a while of doing neurology and neurosurgery, I went to the Maudsley Hospital in London and trained as a psychiatrist. And so that was how I got to there. And then I met a person, he was giving a lecture, and I was fascinated by the title of the lecture. It was the role of the right hemisphere in consciousness. And this was a man called John Cutting. And I'd heard a lot about the left hemisphere, you know, responsible for language. And when you have a stroke, you can't speak, you can't read, you can't use your right hand. Terrible. But I'd heard nothing about the right hemisphere. Almost it was like the right hemisphere didn't really do anything. So I thought I'll go along and hear. And what I learned at that lecture was absolutely fascinating. It was that the right hemisphere understands implicit meaning, metaphors, jokes, tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, all the implicit mass of meaning, where the left hemisphere is very literal minded. The right hemisphere sees everything in its context, whereas the left hemisphere takes it out of its context and puts it in a category. So it's at one blow, it's been disembodied, decontextualized, and made general. So it's lost its uniqueness. And I was just thinking, this is extraordinary, because this is precisely the set of things that I was trying to express in my earlier book against criticism. And of course, the right hemisphere doesn't have a voice. Our voice comes from the left hemisphere. They both take part in language, but for almost all right-handers anyway, language, speech is in the left hemisphere. And so I went up to him afterwards and said, that was the most fascinating thing I've ever heard. And I told him about my book, and he said, can I read it? And then we started researching, or I joined him. He was already researching on hemisphere differences. And then I went later to Johns Hopkins, which is a big hospital in Baltimore in the US, to do brain imaging on symmetries and asymmetries in the brain. And that started me on a 30-year mission. But all my colleagues said, you mustn't do this, because everybody knows that this stuff about hemispheres, it's just pop psychology. It's all rubbish. It's been blown out of the water long, long ago. And I thought, no, there's something very important here. I mean, for one thing, why is the brain divided at all? Since its only purpose is to make connections. Why would you want it to be divided? Why? And all the brains we've looked at in all animals are divided. Why? Why would it be asymmetrical? The brain is asymmetrical. The two halves are not symmetrical. And why would the band of fibers that connects the brain, two halves of the brain, called the corpus callosum, why is that so much to do with inhibition? That's remarkable. So that set me off on a really interesting philosophical conundrum, which I was able to answer using science.
Do you have, I mean, what is your answer to that question? Why is the brain divided? Because it must have had some kind of evolutionary gain to be divided.
Exactly. And as I say, every single creature that has a neural network, even the ancestor of a brain, is asymmetrical. And I believe, and nobody has ever come up with a more satisfactory hypothesis than the one I have, which is that everything that lives has to accomplish two contradictory things. It has to be able to target something very precisely so that it can pick it up quickly, something that it needs to eat, whether that be a seed against a background of gravel, or whether that be a rabbit or whatever it is. It needs to be able to focus on something, target it, and get it very quickly. But if it's paying that very narrow, committed attention, it won't see everything else. And so it won't see predators. It won't see its mates, its conspecific, its young, that it also needs to be watching. And so all creatures have this capacity to divide attention, and that means with two parts of their brain. One part dedicated to grabbing and getting, and the other to seeing the whole picture. And I give a sort of soundbite about this, that the left hemisphere helps us manipulate the world. The right hemisphere helps us understand the world.
Mm. Well, I guess you have talked with Simon Baron Cohen on brain research. He wrote this book, The Pattern Seekers, for example.
Yes.
Do you know him, by the way? Do you know him?
I've met him, but I don't know. I couldn't say I know him. No.
But would you say that the people he talks about, I mean, on the autism spectrum, do they have sort of an overcapacity in the left hemisphere? Is that how you would interpret it?
Well, I suppose it depends very much what you mean by patterns, you see, because some patterns are systems, and people of this kind can see what I would call gestalten, using the German word. I don't know whether you use the same word in Swedish. Yeah. And these are different from systematic structures, which are built up mechanistically from the starting point to the next point, and you build up like you build an edifice. And these systems are mechanical and can be predicted, and machines are like this. But organisms are not like machines. They are complex, not just complicated, systems that contain recursive loops, that don't have efficient causes in the way that a machine does. Something pushes it and then the chain reaction goes. And these organisms are best seen as gestalten. They are wholes which cannot be accounted for by summing the parts. And so I think the typical person with autism is the pattern seeker who makes systems, builds systems in a somewhat architectural or almost bureaucratic way. Whereas what is important is people who see a problem solved by seeing it just from a different angle. And some of these people may be on the autistic spectrum too. But it's very interesting if you read the accounts of pretty much any great scientist or mathematician, and I've read many of them, there is a moment, they do a lot of work and they get nowhere. And then there is an aha moment where the penny drops, when they're thinking about something completely different. There's a famous example of Henri Poincaré, who was working away on a particular math problem, and he went into town, and at the very moment that he'd done his shopping, he put his foot on the step of the bus, the solution came to him, and it took him a couple of weeks to work out exactly why. Einstein was the same. Einstein said, I have a solution, I don't yet know how to arrive at it.
What would you say happens there? What happens in the brain before such a moment happens?
Well, I think there are different phases to being creative. One is the sort of laying down of necessary groundwork. So you won't create out of nothing. You have to be familiar with the territory. And that is routine and can be done consciously, acquiring the background information, the skills to work on it. And then you play with things, but you don't find the answer. And the moment of illumination comes when you are thinking about something else. And this is because when we think very definitely about a problem, if you think very intensively about a problem, you recruit more and more very narrowly focused concentric neural networks, mainly in the left hemisphere. It's like looking more and more intensely into the center of a spotlight to see what's there. But what you actually need to do is to be able to stand back and stop this process, which is like a spasm or a cramp in the mental world, and let go. And when you relax, your right hemisphere, which is much better at pulling things together, is able to bring together ideas from all over the place, and suddenly they create a new picture. And that is the moment that every artist, every scientist, every mathematician lives for.
Me as a fiction writer, I can feel how work is being done inside of me when I'm not thinking, but I can feel it. And then I just need to put on some music and then it comes. It's like I open some kind of it's like water pouring over me. So I can feel in the silence something's working, and then music is like turning on the switch of a light, and I see everything.
How marvelous. And you know that Einstein did the same thing. He used to be working on something, then he'd go to the piano and he'd play, and then his daughter describes how he'd suddenly get up and go, I've got it. And it was through music, playing his violin or just playing on the keyboard. And of course, that's very interesting to me, because music is a very good example of what I believe is the way the world is built up, not from things, but from relationships. In fact, in the new book, The Matter with Things, I argue that there are really no things, or there are only things secondarily to relationships. What primarily exists are relationships. And music is just relationships. I mean, of course, it's made out of notes, but if I give you a note and ask you what it means, the answer is precisely nothing. There is absolutely nothing this note means. And I give you another one, it still means nothing. I give you 100,000 and you can compose Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, and it means everything. So it's all in the relations, it's all in the connections, the gaps, the bits between. And that, of course, is actually how our world is constructed as well. It is constructed out of relations between things.
Are you familiar with Carlo Rovelli?
Yes, I am. I mean, I've heard him talk. Yes, why do you ask?
Yeah. Because Christer has published his book called Helgoland.
Yeah.
And this is his as well. There are no things, everything is built up with relationships.
Right.
He would say the same thing.
It's describing the quantum mechanics in that way very much. It has to be understood as relationships rather than objects, so to speak. I mean, that's his ontology, his view of reality, basically. Yes. And also, I must say, a lot of what you're saying now sounds quite familiar. It sounds a bit like Douglas Hofstadter. You probably read "I Am a Strange Loop" with. Yeah, I have, and it's a lot of agreements between the two of you, I think, on those issues. Maybe not on all other things.
No, I don't know. And, I've never spoken with Hofstadter, but I must say I very, very much enjoyed Gödel, Escher, Bach.
Yes.
Partly because I love Bach anyway, and the way in which he plays on the Goldberg variations is enormously clever. And of course, I think that Lewis Carroll was enormously creative, and Gödel is a very important part of my philosophical position. And of course, Escher, who I use to illustrate various things in both my books. So, yes.
Yeah, that book was a game changer for me as well. I read it when I was 20 years old, and it completely changed my life. So I studied theoretical computer science because of that book, actually. And Douglas Hofstadter has become a very good friend of the two of us now. So I actually published a book in America and England called The Flame of Reason, which is partly co-written with him. So.
Okay. Fantastic.
But let me go back to this creative process of scientific geniuses. I know that Gödel also talked about that he more or less in meditation came up with ideas of his sort of mathematical ontology, which was in a way breaking with the Vienna Circle, because he showed that truth and provability is not the same thing, for example.
Exactly.
In what sense is Gödel important to your philosophy, as you just mentioned?
Well, because he shows that we can never grasp something completely finally, that we can't, that there is always some aspect that lies beyond what it is that we have achieved in our system building. And that's part of it, I think. But also this point that truth is not the same as provability. And I write about that quite a bit in both books. That truth is, again, a relationship, actually. The word, what is the word in Swedish for truth?
Sanning.
Sanning.
Sanning with a with an N.
So
like in
what does
Nicholas.
that? What does it mean etymologically?
Oh,
I don't know that.
I don't know either. Actually,
No.
Sanning. I'll find out and email you.
Yeah. Interesting. But anyway, truth is related to originally an old word, troth. We still use this slightly old-fashioned thing when two people get married. There's a rather archaic expression, they plight their troth. Their troth is their loyalty to one another. And true means loyal in a relationship, that they work together, they fit together, and so on. So it's not about provability, and many truths can't be proved, and many things that can be proved are not necessarily true, as Friedrich Weismann himself said.
Can I just say, and this thing about speaking the truth, Dante said that the circle beyond, I think, the ninth circle, that's where the poets are, because poets lie. He wasn't a right hemisphere guy, I suppose, Dante.
He probably was, yes. I like that.
But let me still test an idea with you and see what you say when it comes to Gödel, because as I see it, Gödel has been very much misused in popular culture, to sort of defend a lot of ideas that maybe is not so consistent after all. For example, I've heard people say that Gödel shows that there are phenomena in the universe that we will never be able to understand. And I think that's a wrong conclusion, because first of all, it could be the case that all phenomena in the universe are possible to describe with a provable subset of mathematical theorems, first of all. And secondly, a phenomena in the universe, I mean, if an equation like E equals mc squared, for example, if that is true or not, it's not a mathematical issue. It's a question of whether it corresponds to reality or not. So do you agree that Gödel is quite misunderstood as well by many people?
I do indeed. And of course, it would be ludicrous to say that there are things that we... I mean, there are reasons like the limitations of our human brains, which mean there will be things that we may not be able to understand. We don't know what it is we miss. I mean, the definition, by definition, you don't know the things you don't know. So, but on the other hand, that's not what he's saying. And of course, we understand many things. But what is wonderful is that there are conclusions that are true within a system, but it cannot be proved to be true.
Yeah, and that's right.
Therefore, there are things of which we cannot be certain. And one of the problems, I almost wrote a book. In fact, I think that the Against Criticism book might have been at one stage going to be called Against Certainty. And I think I've had a lifelong crusade against certainty. I'm a great believer in uncertainty. And of course, the left hemisphere needs certainty because it's a predator. So, I mean, let's get to the point where I say, if you hear me talk about the hemispheres and you don't know my work, forget everything you've ever heard about them. I say this to your listeners because it's wrong. So it's not true that the left hemisphere is unemotional but reliable, and the right hemisphere is a fantasist but emotional. Both hemispheres deal in emotion, both deal in reason, and when it comes down to it, the left hemisphere is the fantasist and the right hemisphere is the one that is much more veridical. So, I'm talking about something quite different. But one factor, I mean, all the stuff I say is empirically based in studies of patients who have something wrong with one hemisphere or the other, and either are studied phenomenologically or report phenomenologically or are scanned or are subjected to various kinds of tests. So it's all based in empirical science. And one of the things is that people who have a hypo-functioning right hemisphere and therefore more reliant than usual on the left need black and white answers. They need, it must be this or it must be that. What do you mean it could be both, or it might be a bit of this and a bit of that? So it is very much in need of a simple certainty, because as it were, it's looking at something it's got to catch immediately. It's no good going, is that a rabbit? Well, I think it's probably a rabbit, but so it's got to go rabbit, you know. And
20% are rabbits.
20% of rabbit. But of course, as you know, Wittgenstein has this wonderful image, which is borrowed from a children's magazine in the late 19th century, of the duck rabbit. Is it a duck or is it a rabbit?
Yeah.
Depending on how you look at it. Yeah. So, yeah. And where were we? What were we talking about? What do you want to talk about?
I want to go on this.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you maybe a meta question in this respect. Would you say that sort of modern neuroscience and neurophilosophy is confirming your ideas during the last 10 or 20 years or longer, since you sort of started to formulate your ideas? Is the science confirming what you're saying, or is it moving away to a more positivistic view of the brain, or logical, whatever you want to call it?
There are two aspects to that. One seems to be that you're asking me about whether science is moving away from a reductionist, wholly materialist vision.
Yeah, that's what I'm
asking. The other
actually
is, okay, let me answer that.
Concerning the brain science.
Yes, well, the great thing is that it's been clear, hasn't it, for at least 100 years in physics, that the reductionist mechanistic vision is not satisfactory. So physicists moved on from this mid-Victorian hydraulic mechanistic idea 100 years ago. And curiously, the scientists of life, the biologists, have stuck to it. Well, the scientists who deal with inanimate matter have shown that actually no piece of matter can be separated from consciousness. There are, believe it or not, tenured professors holding jobs, no doubt lavishly paid in Western universities, who say there is no such thing as consciousness. Well, this is hilarious. I mean, if it's an illusion, it's got to be an illusion in consciousness. You've got to have consciousness to have an illusion. So anyway, so I do think that now biology is moving away from this. There are a lot of signs that one of the things that was a catalyst for this was the decoding of the genome. And in the early 19th century, along with the physicists, there were a whole lot of very, very interesting and intelligent biologists who were beginning to see how they, like the physicists, needed to move to an organic and a non-mechanistic idea of relationships between mind and matter and life, and looking at life in general. But then along came molecular biology and genetics, and suddenly everything went very mechanistic again. It was almost like back to Descartes. But since we did this heroic thing of decoding the genome and found that there's almost nothing in it, I mean, far too little information in it, and people are beginning to think, okay, so there's something else here that we're missing. And quite what that is, of course, we don't know, but it's something that is three-dimensional, that is not just a set of linear instructions. Epigenetics has begun to help with that. And so I do think there are changes, yes, going on in the way in which biology, funnily enough, neuroscience of all the branches of biology has remained the most stuck in, because, you know, a lot of people think, well, it's just like a wiring diagram for a computer, you know, it's just, and that, unfortunately, the proximity of that metaphor of the computer has derailed the thinking of many neuroscientists. Not completely, there are plenty who are not, but I think there's that tendency. And in chapter 12 of my newer book, The Matter with Things, a chapter called The Science of Life, a Study in Left Hemisphere Capture, I show at least 8 respects in which a machine and an organism are not comparable. So I find that people are much more open to this than they used to be. At the moment, I'm having conversations with Mike Levin, who is a developmental biologist at Tufts. And he's an open-minded guy. He's been brought up in the tradition of, mechanistic ways of looking at the brain, but he's also interested in lateralization and interested in things that go a little bit beyond the simply mechanistic.
But what is your view of consciousness then? Because if it's not an illusion, what is it? Is it an emergent phenomena from the brain's physical configuration, or is it something else, in your opinion?
I think it's something else. The one thing that we can be certain of, which is why it's so hilarious that you have people who deny consciousness, the one and only thing we can be certain of, and in this Descartes was right, that we have consciousness. I mean, it's the one thing. Everything else, we don't really know for sure, but at least we know we've got consciousness. And we know that matter is something that we come to be aware of because of consciousness, but we don't know that consciousness is something we're aware of because of matter. It might be, it might not be. And my guess is that it is not, because the idea that you can sort of incrementally approach consciousness and have just a tiny bit of it, it is, as William James pointed out, once you've crossed the divide to consciousness, you've taken a step. And people say, well, there's kind of nascent consciousness, there's almost consciousness. But that's wrong. There is a complete divide between consciousness and, there may be different degrees of consciousness. I'm not saying that all consciousness is the same, and the consciousness of a plant is like the consciousness of a dog or the consciousness of a human being. But I believe they're all conscious. In fact, I believe consciousness is what the cosmos is made of. And in this, I'm quite in a tradition of many 20th century physicists, and also in the same tradition as most of the great philosophical wisdom traditions of the East. Consciousness is the primary element. And I hold matter to be not somehow alien to consciousness, but to be an aspect of consciousness. I say a phase of consciousness. And by phase, I don't mean a phase in time. I mean a phase in the sense that chemists say that water has phases. In one of its phases, it is translucent and flowing. In another, it is solid and white and very, very cold and doesn't flow. And in another, it's in the air around you and you can't see it, you can't tell it's there, but it's keeping you alive. So water has phases, and I think consciousness has phases, and one of its phases is matter. So consciousness can, as it were, under certain circumstances, hold an aspect of consciousness steady for longer. It does two things, matter. One is it provides a degree of permanence. I say only a degree of permanence because nothing is ever permanent, but it, as it were, slows down the way in which consciousness, with its diaphanous nature, things that you think they've suddenly gone, but the table that was there yesterday is here today, and it's matter. And the other thing that it provides is resistance, and resistance is extremely important in my belief. Resistance is what every act of creation requires. Without it, there could be none. And a simple way of thinking of this is friction. What is friction? Friction is the very thing that stops motion. It is also the very thing that starts motion. Without friction, I couldn't move. Every movement I make is because of friction. And so resistance has a philosophical importance, which I elaborate quite a lot in the last part, the ontological part of The Matter with Things.
But can I ask you, I mean, it sounds to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're not a panpsychist, because they would say that consciousness is an element of matter, but you say the opposite. You say matter is an element of consciousness.
Yes, I don't think it matters too much unless you're a dogmatist when it comes to that point. Because they only say that because they're used to feeling confident that they know what matter is. But actually, if you talk to physicists, they say that it's rather embarrassing supposing that by reducing consciousness to matter, we can understand it better. Because quite frankly, as physicists, we haven't the slightest clue what matter is.
No, but that's so true.
Yeah.
John Clauser said that at the Nobel Prize ceremony, that after a lifetime spent in this, I have no idea what it represents, what it is.
That's right. It's very, very good. Yes. So I don't think it matters which way round you look at it. What matters more is whether you think there is some kind of huge divorce between them, that there is a sort of, as Descartes thought, res extensa and a res cogitans. I don't hold it like that.
No.
Okay, but let me ask you this then: doesn't consciousness require something or someone who is conscious on a cosmical level?
It might seem like that, but I don't think it's necessarily the case. We know that we are people, it's true, but is a plant a person? I don't know whether I would accord that status to a plant, but there is a lot of evidence, some of which I deal with in the book, that plants have consciousness. That is to say, they have intelligence. They can solve problems which they could not be prepared for by their either individual history or their phylogenetic history or anything in their DNA. So they are able to be conscious, I believe.
I thought you
and
meant...
if that's...
no, sorry, please go on.
Sorry, go on. No, carry on. I
thought that you meant a relationship to a person, but I thought you meant the ego or the sense of an I. It wasn't that what you meant.
That's one aspect, but I was just thinking of, I mean, to me, it sounds a little bit like the Spinoza's pantheistic view of the world. Is that close to your... No?
Not at all. No. There is a very, very important distinction to be made between pantheism and panentheism, and I am a panentheist. Okay, and the distinction is, a pantheist believes that God is the sum of all things, and that the sum of all things is God. But a panentheist thinks that God is in all things and that all things are in God. So let us not debate what God is. You'll be amazed to know that I haven't got an answer to that question. But I think that...
Sorry to hear that.
But I think
that would have been great. Yeah.
But the thing is that to assume that because we can't say what God is exactly, that we should just ignore the issue is completely the wrong thing. It seems to me that this question that cannot be answered is the most central question, and that in the end, all the other questions relate to it. And so at the end of the book, having written a chapter on the sense of the sacred, which cost me more trouble than anything that I've ever written, I say that, effectively, what this thing that we call God is, we should not dismiss, because actually coming to recognize that that something somewhere is the most important element in our life. So I haven't expressed it as well as I do on paper. But because it is a very difficult thing to say. I think that the worry is that because we can't say what it is exactly, we dismiss it altogether. But there should be a God-shaped area, as it were, in our consciousness, right in the center of it. And that by holding that, we do begin to say, not being able to say what it is in language is not the same as not being able to know something about it.
Good.
But let me ask you this way then. As a non-religious person, as I consider myself to be, would you say that the question of the nature of God, is it the same question as if I would say the question is what is the nature of reality? Or is it two different questions in your view?
I think there are two different questions, yes. But I see why you say that. It's just that depending on what you mean by reality and depending what you mean by God. And these are two terms that are notoriously slippy and very difficult to pin down. And so in the end, it boils down to an unsatisfactory point about language, really. But I believe that whatever it is that has been meant since time immemorial by this grounding whatever, in Chinese it's li, in Sanskrit it's ruta, in Greek it was logos, whatever it is, Yahweh, God. That God is the grounding of all being, and all being is in that God, and God is in all being. So further than that, philosophically, one can't go, but one can go further through experience and through things like poetry, drama, myth, ritual, and of course music. So these are things that, to me, make the nature of God manifest. But when, rather as St. Augustine said, I know that there is time, but when you ask me to describe what time is, I cannot say. And I would say that my experience tells me that there is something that the only way to describe it is with a word like the sacred, the divine, that exists. But if you ask me to explain in words what it is, I can't. Language is a very poor medium for many things. In fact, all the really important questions are failed by language. Language is a utilitarian tool that we developed for getting by, helping us to use things, organize people, and say, we're going to go over there and beat up that lot over. It's not designed for the subtle intuitions that we have.
And like Louis Armstrong said, if you have to ask what yes is, you will never know.
Yes, that's right, yes.
I've heard some lectures with you. Is it called the William Blake Society?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I gave the annual Blake lecture. Yeah. Yes.
I love them. Would you tell us something about your relationship to Blake?
Well, yes. He's a fascinating man. He's obviously one of the greatest poets in the English language. I think probably my all-time greatest poet in the English language is Wordsworth, but there's no doubt that Blake was a towering genius. And he was able to inhabit more than one realm. I mean, quite literally, he saw and heard things that we don't. And, wearing my psychiatrist hat, I sort of wonder if he wasn't just a little bit psychotic at times.
Yeah.
Nowadays, he would have been given an antipsychotic tablet and told to, come back next week, and he would not have written any poems. I don't know. But
just like Jung as well, Carl Gustav Jung as well, I suppose.
So, about Jung?
Yeah, he would have been hospitalized, I think.
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
But what I'm not saying, however, is that you have to be mad to be creative, or that all the stuff that's produced by people who are mentally ill is creative. Very little of it is, but sometimes it is, and sometimes that is part of the illness. But in any case, he was a brilliant perceiver of the coincidence of opposites, which is a very, very important part of my philosophy. And I devote the whole of the first chapter in part 3 of that book, the Matter with Things. The first chapter is on the coincidence of opposites. So So he was able to see these things and express them in just very vibrant language. There are many contradictions about Blake. I mean, he's one of the most contradictory people you can possibly speak about. Because, for example, he wrote some really rather awful, sort of rambling, baggy poems. But he also wrote these lapidary, very small miniatures, like beautiful ivory Netskis or something like this. He wrote these very, very concentrated gems. And you know, you can find things where he says one thing and says an opposite and so on. So whatever you want to believe about Blake, you can probably find it there.
It was like he had many personalities, I think, who all strived to get
Possibly.
out, and yeah.
Possibly, yes.
Okay, just one last sort of theme before we end. I really must ask you what you think about the latest developments in artificial intelligence. I mean, a lot of people are worried now. Are you worried? Are you worried they can develop consciousness, or do you not think that consciousness will go into the machines?
I'm not sure about that, but in some ways I think it's the least important worry. There are many worries, but whether a net of this kind could be conscious, I don't hold as impossible at all. What I do worry about is the debasing of truth. The capacity for lies effectively to be committed, to be propagated, and for people to place far too much trust in AI. One also needs to remember that AI reaches everywhere, from the sort of things that we have to interact with if we go online in order to do a bank transaction, and these very sexy things that are going on in California where they're developing chatbots and so on. And for most of us, most of the time, what AI is something that is enormously frustrating, enormously diminishing of what is human, and very, very unintelligent. I say AI, it's quite wrong to call it artificial intelligence. It's artificial information processing. And that is what it can do very, very fast, but it has no intelligence. And it makes up stuff on the principle that this looks like it's a good fit here.
Yeah,
exactly.
Statistics.
Yeah.
Have you tried the ChatGPT-4?
I haven't myself, but I've been with friends when they were trying it. And they asked them, give a summary of Iain McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary in 700 words. And it didn't do a bad job, actually. But I also know that if you ask it to give the life of somebody, it will make up facts. It will make up dates.
Exactly. It's so fascinating. Yeah. I tried it myself the other day and asked about myself, and it made a very good presentation. And then it presented some of the books I've written, which some of them were completely fake. They don't exist.
Yes, wonderful. Yes. I mean, this is terribly worrying. And people will believe it rather than reality. Yeah. I mean, there's already a hilarious problem, which is of the sat nav or the GPS system in a car, you know. You get people who say, you know, you're driving, you say, well, we haven't reached the right place. But the GPS says this is where it is, you know. But yeah, but when I look out the window, that's not where we are, you know. So people are becoming more willing to trust a machine, however stupid, rather than trust reality and experience. And I think that it's making us more machine-like, interacting. In a way, you have to lower yourself to the level of the machine. Otherwise, you find yourself endlessly frustrated because you can't really answer its question. And indeed, I had the experience of giving a lecture for Oxford University last year, and I was very pleased that I didn't expect to be paid, but they wanted to pay me quite nicely. And in the old days, when this happened, the university chest, which is where the money is, would send me a check. Job done. Now, I had to go online and fill in a questionnaire, and in it, he wanted to know what it was I had done. And there were boxes for window cleaning, catering, but there wasn't one for giving a lecture. And I said, oh, right, what do I do? And I rang them up and I said, this is maddening. I mean, this university that exists only for teaching doesn't have a box to tick where what you've done is to teach. What am I supposed to do? Because without it, I can't go any further. And the person said, oh, don't tell us about it. It's an absolute nightmare. It makes everything slow and complicated. I said, well, what do? I'll just lie. So, I mean, even they say, just lie, tick any old box. So this is the kind of rubbish that we waste our time in. And I find now that everyone is saying, I don't have any time anymore. Everything takes so long. And one of the reasons is because of AI. It is destroying our lives. And, the promise that it will save us from things is extraordinarily unlikely. It's going to bring all kinds of menaces, total control, mass unemployment, mass degradation of educational standards in schools and universities, where it's almost impossible to tell whether this person really understands this or just got a bot to write it. What happens in the law? Did this person commit this act? All kinds of fake things can be produced that seem to be, in the old days, we had a phrase, the camera never lies. Well, now the camera lies all the time. So, what happens in politics? Who do you really believe? It has destroyed the ability to be truthful, and it has therefore destroyed trust. And there's an old Chinese saying, 3rd century emperor, who said, for a people to survive, they need guns, food, and trust. If they have to give up one, give up the guns. If you have to give up another, give up the food, but never give up the trust. Without trust, they can't survive. And that's where we're at now.
So you are quite worried, I can hear that, about AI.
I'm extremely worried about it, yes. And by the way in which very, very rapidly it is beginning to spy on us, and anyway, sorry, are you at the end of the time or something?
No, I was going to say that on that happy note, thank you so much.
No, but
I do have happier notes. Yes.
No, but this was an extremely interesting conversation. And Iain, your book will be published in Sweden in I think September or something like that, in the autumn.
Good.
It would be wonderful to invite you to Stockholm to come here and give a speech, if that would be possible. But we can, of course, talk about that later on. But it would be great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being in our podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me along. And I wish we'd had more time. There are so many things to talk about.